This is one of the most well-known poems in American literature. Even lots of people who don't know anything about poetry remember reading this one in school. It seems to be a really simple, straightforward poem, but there are a couple of wrinkles in it that make it not quite as simple as it appears to be at first glance. When I read this in school, maybe in high school, I have a dim memory of the teacher saying that this poem is about being yourself, going your own way, marching to your own drummer. Don't take the path everyone else takes. Take your own path, even if most others don't. And because in high school I was a guy to let the teacher do my thinking for me, I accepted that. A number of years later, when I was in graduate school, I found myself teaching an introduction to literature class. It was one of the first classes I ever taught. We did a few short stories, some poems, a couple of plays, and I put The Road Not Taken on the syllabus because it was short and sweet and pretty easy to explain. But a few days before we were to discuss it in class, I sat down to reread it. And when I did, I had an epiphany. I realized that it didn't say what I thought it did. It was a little more complicated. Even though the title of the poem is The Road Not Taken, many folks translate that to The Road Less Traveled. But when we make that mental adjustment, we start down the wrong road, to stick with the metaphor of the poem. Let's read it and make a few comments as we go along. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. That's clear enough. The traveler is in a woods. He has come to a fork in the road or path. He would like to take both paths, but he can't. He's got to make a choice. And he stands and thinks about it for a long time. We might also note that it's in the fall of the year. We know that because it's a yellow wood. So that tells us that the trees are perhaps sugar maples, aspens, birches, because those trees have yellow leaves. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, and then took the other, just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I mark the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. All right, now the interesting thing about this is that both paths are about the same. Neither one of them have been traveled much, at least recently. They both equally lay in leaves no step had trodden. So he starts down one, thinking that someday he'll come back and try the other, but down deep he doubts that he will because way leads on to way in life, and it's hard ever to get back to where you were before. Now, before we discuss what this poem means, let's look at the last stanza. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So in the last stanza, he tells us that he took the road less traveled by. But in the earlier stanza, he says they were traveled about the same. What's the deal? Why the contradiction? Robert Frost is a good enough poet to catch something like that, and even if he weren't, surely his editors would. Well, before I answer those questions, Let's talk about symbols for a moment. We're reading this poem with a small group of poems that use symbolism in interesting ways. Remember that a symbol is a tangible thing that stands for something intangible. Tangible means that you can see it, smell it, measure it, touch it. The wood paths here are the tangible things. We can see them and walk down them. They represent life paths or directions. So the wood paths or roads are symbols of life paths. And this is a poem about choices and limitations. It would be perfectly legitimate to say that the subject of this poem is choices. It would also be perfectly legitimate to say that the subject is limitations. When we consider these things in literature, there is often more than one workable response. Now, the theme would be something like this: life choices limit possibilities. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just reality. If you choose to major in psychology, it means you aren't going to major in art. If you choose to marry this person, it means you aren't going to marry these other people. If you choose to attend Pitt Titusville, it means you aren't going to attend Edinburgh, at least right now. Every time we make a choice, every time we go down a path, it means we aren't going to go down other paths. And all of our lives are a continuous set of choices about which paths we will follow, and by extension, which paths we won't. The speaker is like a lot of us in that he has two possibilities that are kind of attractive to him. He would like to do both. He would like to think that someday he'll come back and take the other road, but he knows he probably won't. Life gets busy. We have a lot on our plates. We get preoccupied with the moment, and we usually don't ever get back to where we were. Okay, that makes sense. But what about the contradiction? Is it the less traveled road, or isn't it? And why does it matter? Well, the second and third stanzas make a big point that the roads are equally traveled. There are 20 lines in this poem. 4 of those lines make the point that the roads are equally traveled. That's 25% of the poem. So I'm going to buy that, which leaves us with the last stanza. Let's look at it closely. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. All right, in the last stanza, the poet imagines himself far in the future. He imagines himself as an old man whose life has pretty well been lived, and he imagines himself telling us about his life. Under those circumstances, he says, I took the one less traveled by. Now, isn't that human nature? Isn't it natural for people, when reflecting back on their lives, to alter and color and shape the story to their own satisfaction? I think that's the point. In some ways, I think this poem is kind of about autobiography. Not only about autobiographies that get written down, but the autobiographies we construct of ourselves in our heads. The roads were equally traveled. Neither one was particularly intimidating. But in the telling of it years from now, I'll say that I took the less traveled one. That's what I think it means. I also think the last line is worth noting, and that has made all the difference. It doesn't say that it's made a good difference or a bad difference, just all the difference. Often this last line has been read as being filled with regret or melancholy. And that's partly because the setting of the poem is autumn. Autumn is what we call a universal symbol. A universal symbol is a symbol that has been used so frequently over so many centuries across so many cultures to represent the same thing that it has achieved universal status. The seasons of the year, for example, are universal symbols representing the ages of life. Spring is youth, summer represents the prime of life, autumn represents age and decline, and winter represents death. So since the setting is autumn, with all that represents, many have read the poem's last line as oozing regret. Maybe. But I think we have to read it in context of the previous two lines. Ages and ages hence, he says, that he took the road less traveled by, although we know he didn't. And he says that decision made all the difference. But I suspect that's not true either. The sweep of our lives is typically not determined by a single decision. It is typically determined by many decisions, made day after day, week after week, and year after year. And yet when looking back on our lives, we often simplify our journey. It makes us feel better. We like to think our life paths have been logical and explainable. So, years and years hence, this will be the guy's story. I took this road, and that made all the difference, even though in reality, it probably wasn't that simple. I like this poem a lot, but it's trickier than it first appears.